I'm Janice Fiamengo from the University of Ottawa. My theme today is, do women want equality? A few months ago, John Gormley, a men's rights activist in Ireland, asked his female Facebook friends whether they want to be treated equally to men. A pretty interesting question if one is honest in one's answer. And I'll tell you my answer in another video. The question got me thinking about the way equality is evoked in both the men's rights and feminist camps, with both sides claiming it as their goal. Is it the case that the two sides mean something different when they use the term? Is it even a useful word to describe an achievable relation between men and women? From what I have observed, women often claim they want to be treated equally based on a perception that men are treated better than women. This is the explicit or implicit assumption in nearly all feminist discourse, that the workplace and society in general is a fair and friendly place if you're male. What women often mean when they talk about being treated equally, then, is that they want to be treated well. They want their good qualities recognized and rewarded, their bad qualities overlooked or understood. With no standard of comparison, because most women don't know or don't care to know the experience of men, many women perceive any form of unpleasantness in their work lives as evidence of gender bias, whether it's a critical boss or a poor performance review. And this is understandable. Most people, given the chance, will prefer to believe themselves unfairly treated than to admit inadequacy. Add to that the feminist worldview that male prejudice is the sea in which women are forced to swim, and you've got a lot of women pumped up about injustice and keen for government to make more laws to combat it. By the way, what I've always found notable is the manner in which our public discussions focus on discriminations against women in the workplace, and never about the bias that works in women's favor. If we're going to talk about discrimination, an equally interesting question is how many women have been unfairly advantaged because of their femaleness, especially if they're nice-looking women. We've all heard about the sexual harassment that women don't like, but we hear nothing about the way sexual attractiveness advantages women, getting them extra assistance from coworkers, special favors from their supervisors, time off, raises, sales contracts, and so on. I'd love a survey that questioned women and men about the instances they've witnessed or experienced of a woman who rose through the ranks at her workplace because she played on men's lust or chivalry. That's a form of inequality that most women keep quiet about, just as you don't hear many women complaining about the inequality of hiring practices that discriminate against men. In fact, many women insist on them. When feminists and the women who support them use the word equality, they frequently refer to equality of result rather than equality of opportunity, with the claim made that because women are not equally represented in certain prestigious fields of work, they're never worrying, of course, about janitorial services or ditch digging, but because women aren't equally represented at the top, that's proof that women are being kept out of those top fields. There's a lot of talk recently about the STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and math. A lot of worry about the underrepresentation of women. Now, even a moment's reflection should reveal that there are likely many reasons why women are not working in particular fields or showing achievements equivalent to men, ranging from the free choices they make to their actual capacities in these fields. But the question of women's capacities has become a forbidden subject in polite society. And that's really too bad because it means that a great deal of time, energy, and other resources are being spent in potentially wasteful or even damaging ways, promoting women, formulating policies to encourage them, and witch-hunting naysayers and truth-tellers. Recently, my attention was drawn by a feminist adversary to a report on a study that she claimed proved that there is gender bias in STEM. Now, I'm not a social scientist, so I invite anyone listening to this to feel free to tell me if my analysis of this outrageously weak study is off the mark. So here goes. Published in March 2015 in the Harvard Business Review, the report is titled "The 5 Biases Pushing Women Out of STEM," and it was sponsored by the Association for Women in Science. The author is Joan Williams, who, with Catherine Phillips and Erica Hall, set out to discover whether women's numbers in STEM are low because of women's personal choices or because of the gender and race biases that they face in science positions. So they interviewed and surveyed hundreds of female scientists, and the results, they claim, quote, provide an important picture of how gender bias plays out in everyday workplace interactions. It sounds like pretty serious stuff, but it isn't. It's a pathetic piece of propaganda masquerading as research. First, a few words about studies sponsored by organizations with an agenda and authored by researchers with an agenda. They tend to produce unreliable results. They ask questions designed to elicit the answers they are seeking. If you go looking for stories of women facing what they perceive to be sexist discrimination, the chances are very good, almost guaranteed in fact, especially in a culture that actively encourages women to see sexist discrimination everywhere, chances are good you'll find it. If the researchers had asked questions probing in a gender-neutral fashion how the respondents had been mentored and assisted in their careers, they might have been able to present a very different picture of science work. But that's not what these researchers sought out. For the first area of bias, remember there are 5, researchers asked women about how they felt treated in terms of their competence and expertise. The result was pretty predictable. Quote, 2/3 of the women interviewed and 2/3 of the women surveyed reported having to prove themselves over and over again, their successes discounted, their expertise questioned. People just assume you're not going to be able to cut it, was one representative comment. Significantly, men were not asked about their experience, whether their successes were discounted, their authority needing to be proved over and over again. And that fact raises serious questions about the meaning of the women's responses. Frankly, I'm a bit surprised that a far higher percentage of survey respondents didn't report having their successes discounted, closer to 100%. And if men had been surveyed, I would expect similarly high rates of complaint. Who hasn't felt, especially in a competitive, high-achieving environment, that their successes were downplayed, that they had to prove themselves? This is an aspect of the human condition, to feel neglected. It may well be that women, for a variety of reasons, are even more sensitive to it. But regardless of why women perceive that they have to prove themselves, the perception is not proof of bias. Moreover, what can't be factored into the survey is the all-important question of competence itself. Perhaps women felt they had to prove themselves because they hadn't yet proved themselves. Perhaps their authority and expertise were questioned because they deserved to be questioned. In an era of widespread affirmative action hiring, in which universities and other institutions are under intense pressure to hire women, and this study just increases the pressure, it makes sense that at least some of the women hired are not top-notch. I know one is not supposed to say that, but it is almost invariably true nonetheless. The other categories of bias are equally, if not more, dubious. In the second, women perceived that they must walk a tightrope between traditional feminine behavior in some aspects of their demeanor and masculine behavior in others. In the third category, women who have children perceived that the children were felt to be a barrier to their professional commitment. In the fourth category, women perceived that other women were mean to them, presumably because of the sexism those other women had experienced. And in the fifth category, many women, especially women of color, felt socially isolated. Now, I could go into a lot of detail about each of these presumed categories of bias, but I'll merely focus on one thing that stands out above all the others. Aside from the fact that there is no comparative data on men's experiences, it is surely significant that there's no comparative data for women in non-STEM occupations and fields. Would women in the social sciences, in business, in the arts, in the helping professions, and in government offices not also report perceptions of bias? What woman doesn't feel, to choose just one category, that her commitments as a mother are sometimes or often in conflict or perceived to be in conflict with her commitment to her profession? What woman doesn't sometimes feel that other women are harder on her than male colleagues or bosses? An interesting issue, perhaps suggesting that getting more women into such positions won't necessarily improve the experience of women, but we won't go there. Do women not often feel pressured to accentuate their femininity? Do women of color not report social alienation in other fields? I strongly suspect that women surveyed, even in fields where they predominate, would offer a similar assessment of bias, given that such bias is perceived to be rampant throughout our entire society. So why is it that STEM fields continue to have low numbers of women while others do not? The matter of bias cannot be the determining factor, as this researcher so definitively claims it is. The whole exercise, in fact, looks more and more like one in which the conclusions were determined long before the first female scientist began giving her predictable answers, designed to call for yet more aggressive affirmative action hiring protocols that will likely result in even more women feeling that their competence is often called into question. Until we can be honest about women's choices, their work preferences, and their intellectual capacity, we will continue to circle this issue of bias for many years to come. For the feminist researchers and for the various diversity consultants and human resources advisors who will be paid to study and make recommendations about increasing women's numbers in STEM, this is a great blessing. But for the rest of us, it's pointless. Until we can admit that equality of outcome is not necessarily a desirable or justly achievable goal, yet another generation of men will compete in unequal hiring competitions with women, and yet another generation of women will be encouraged to see themselves as victims of injustice, even as they undertake careers for which they may be unsuited or ill-qualified. So let's do what we can to foster equality of access and let the outcomes take care of themselves.